So far I've focused exclusively on straight heterosexual adolescents, and I hope you've been wondering about those who are not heterosexual, because they are deserving of the same amount of thought and consideration. Adolescence is usually the time when someone who is homosexual becomes fully aware of their orientation. And notice I said fully aware, meaning that they have an idea before then. In fact, some research indicates that looking back, both male and female adults who are not straight report realizing that they knew something was a little bit different with them as early as 5 or 6 years old. They might not have understood it then. They might not have recognized what they were feeling at the time. But as adults, they can look back and remember feeling something different at a very young age. So their awareness begins much earlier, but a more solid recognition of being LGBTQ usually begins in early adolescence. And with all of the development that takes place during this time, cognitively, socially, emotionally, with families and friends and teachers, juggling all that, and they begin to realize or recognize that they're attracted to the opposite sex. Now, thankfully, in many places, being open about their sexuality for an adolescent is not as difficult as it has been in the past. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of parents and friends and relatives and teachers and churches and anybody else you want to throw in there still strongly discriminate against anybody who is not 100% straight. They might completely ostracize them, they might purposely make their life difficult, especially in adolescence when the feeling of needing to fit in and belong can be very strong. This sends a very definite message of not being okay if you're not straight. The fact is, an adolescent who is LGBTQ is more likely to experience mistreatment from their peers, whether that's verbal abuse or sometimes even physical abuse, physical harassment in varying degrees. They are more likely to have problems in school and to suffer from depression. So there's still a great deal of homophobia, fear and hatred of homosexuals, which encourages adolescents and people of all ages who are not straight to keep their sexual identity secret. But it's really important to pay attention to what the textbook says here regarding the average age of coming out declining in recent decades, from the average age being 21 in the 70s to 16 now. And the reason that has declined is probably because of the growing acceptance in our society as a whole. For example, you're probably aware that gay-straight alliances, or GSAs, have been formed in high schools and at the post-secondary level, and sometimes even in middle schools. These are organizations led by students themselves and supported by at least one teacher, whose purpose is to provide a safe space for LGBTQ students, a supportive environment, an inclusive environment, as well as for people who support them. So students can get together, talk, socialize, maybe have lunch together, whatever it is. And their conversations may be purposeful and focused on advocating for equal rights, or it just may be hanging out. So these may be places where students can meet to discuss experiences that are related to their sexual orientation and gender identity. And they may be places where they can simply relax and socialize. Now, these first emerged in the 80s, but they didn't start the way you might think. The very first gay-straight alliance was formed in November of 1988 at the Concord Academy in Concord, Massachusetts, when a history teacher there named Kevin Jennings came out as gay. He and some other teachers at the school formed the first gay-straight alliance along with a student named Meredith Sterling. Now, she was straight, but she was upset about how students who were gay were being treated. Now, the purpose of the organization was to fight against homophobia and for changes to California's non-discrimination policy. GSAs are found primarily in the US and Canada, although they do exist in a few other countries. And across the board, studies have clearly shown that gay-straight alliances have very positive effects academically and regarding mental health and regarding social issues. So for example, research was conducted in Canada that showed that sexual minority students attending schools that did have a GSA said they had greater feelings of support and were more likely to be open about their gender and sexual orientation. So for them, attending a school with a GSA improved their social and their school experience overall. It really helped to reduce psychological stress they might be feeling. And they felt like they had greater feelings of support having this GSA in their school. For students who are not straight, when there's a GSA in their school, this is also positively correlated with better academic performance, a greater likelihood of going on to post-secondary education, and fewer absences from school, which really makes sense to me. In addition, if schools have a gay-straight alliance, sexual minority students across the board report that they have less discrimination and that they also are less likely to have suicidal thoughts, which can be a very, very big problem with LGBTQ students. So don't get me wrong, homophobia is still a problem, and in many areas it continues to be really persistent. At the same time, the younger generation are clearly much more accepting than the older generation. They really are more open to people who are not exactly like they are. They're just more unbiased. Now, when an adolescent comes out, when they openly recognize their sexual identity and start to tell their family and friends about it, this actually doesn't usually occur until late adolescence or emerging adulthood. Could happen earlier, but the majority it's at this time. For the majority, it's late adolescence. And most often, they will come out first to a friend, not their family, which I find really interesting and really does a lot to demonstrate the importance of friends at this age. How much friends are really valued in this age bracket that the majority tell a friend first. And when a young person does come out to their friends or their family, I want you to be aware that it's not a quick process. It's not just a quick tidbit or a quick conversation. It isn't just an add-on. It's usually something that occurs over time. Now, for parents, it may be a shock, and not surprisingly, when an adolescent comes out to their parents and the parent is not supportive, this is going to make the adolescent's life much more difficult themselves to be rejected in this way. So let me just really highlight then that it's quite important that they usually come out to a friend and not a family member. So this is a really clear example of how friends become so much more important at this age as opposed to family. Let me just kind of summarize what we've been over so far here. We looked at the difference between courting and dating, that what it means to be in love changes at different points in your life. We looked at dating scripts, which are kind of like guidelines people follow. Sternberg's theory of love, with a mixture of passion and love and commitment, and according to Sternberg, that results in different kinds of love. We looked at Bradford Brown's developmental model of adolescent love, which is specifically focused on adolescence and really focuses on the importance of friends and peers. We looked at sexuality and how that starts and proceeds for adolescence, that it usually begins with masturbation, then kissing and necking, then petting, then intercourse. And what does all of this tell us? All of these demonstrate an exploration of sexuality, a method of exploring sexuality as adolescents reach sexual maturity. So we know that during this time of life, an interest in sexuality is usually high, even if they're not sexually active at all. It's not unusual in any way for an adolescent to have a high degree of interest in sexual issues. So not surprisingly, pornography is something that many have an interest in. And this is not just because of easy access to the internet. Your text mentions, and I agree, that way before the internet existed, porn was something adolescents were interested in, especially boys. So it might have been, looking at their dad's Playboy or Hustler, and it might have been really bad pornographic films on VHS tapes. But that's still pornography. Now, is that different than the internet? absolutely 1,000% different than the internet, because now there are millions upon millions of pornographic images and films and books and sexual aids and anything else you can imagine within really, really easy, quick reach. And a lot of it you don't even have to pay for. So yes, it is really significant, and it's not a myth that viewing porn is still much more common for boys than girls. Now, what's our big question? Our big question is, does this have a negative effect on adolescents or not? Does it cause them to have some kind of messed up perception of sexuality? Does it make them have unrealistic expectations and does it cause boys to have an innately poor perception of women and want to degrade them and so on? Well, remember that correlation does not signal causality. When two things happen at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. It just means they happen at the same time. And as stated in the text, people who view pornography are more likely than non-viewers to abuse substances and to report delinquency. But this doesn't necessarily mean that watching pornography somehow causes them to be more delinquent and abuse substances more. Maybe they were doing those things first. So it's really, really hard to establish and prove causality in terms of pornography, and frankly, when it comes to any kind of media research. Because people usually choose what they consume in the media based on their pre-existing personal qualities and their pre-existing behaviors. So what they choose to consume, what they choose to watch, reflects who they are to begin with. Now, how does culture affect all this? Because so far throughout the course, I've talked about the difference between traditional collectivistic cultures and more modern individualistic cultures quite a bit. Well, we know obviously that no matter what culture you grow up in, you're going to have certain similarities because we're all human beings. So the basic physical and sexual maturation that occurs during adolescence is going to be the same. So for a girl, no matter where you are in the world, you will start to menstruate. It might be a little bit earlier, a little bit later, it might be perceived differently, but the process is the same. Now, while the biological process of sexual maturity is the same, the experience of it can be very different because there can be enormous differences in how some cultures view sexuality, not just for adolescents, but for everybody. And your textbook refers specifically to a book called Patterns of Sexual Behavior by Cleland Ford and Frank Beach. And you might notice that this book was first published in 1951 and think, what the heck are they doing talking about a book and research that's so old? There is no way it can still be relevant. Well, it is, because what they did was gather information about sexuality from almost 200 different cultures and compared it all. And it's because of this that the book and their findings are still really valuable. So the cultures they gathered information from included 48 in Oceania, 28 from Eurasia, 33 from Africa, 57 from North America, and 26 from South America. And in compiling this information, the authors got pretty specific, looking at things like sexual positions, length of intercourse, locations for intercourse, orgasm experiences, types of foreplay, courting behaviors, frequencies of intercourse, and typical methods of attracting a partner. Now, what we're going to focus on is their description of 3 types of cultural approaches to adolescent sexuality: restrictive, semi-restrictive, and permissive. Restrictive cultures are just that. They are restrictive, they are limiting, they are confining. And because of that, they place very strong limits on adolescent sexuality before marriage. Remember, I talked to you about the gender intensification hypothesis, which says that gender differences become much more pronounced in the adolescent years, and that in traditional cultures, sexual maturation usually means much more restriction for girls. And I spoke about the Zapotec culture in Mexico and how girls are no longer allowed to go anywhere, not even to the market, without being supervised. And I talked about how there's almost no contact whatsoever between girls and boys from the start of adolescence. This is an example of a sexually restrictive culture, when there is really strict separation of boys and girls through adolescence. Although in some restrictive cultures, this could even begin in childhood, with boys and girls leading almost completely separate lives from an early age. Now, with all of this in mind, it's the norm in this kind of culture for premarital sex to be prohibited. Not just inappropriate, not just discouraged or viewed negatively, absolutely prohibited. And this may be reflected in very, very strong social norms, so that you will be completely looked down upon. It might be considered shameful for you and your family to have any sexual experience before marriage. In other countries and cultures, not maintaining your virginity until marriage may even be punishable by physical retribution, whipping, stoning, or death. In some Arab countries, this is not unheard of. There's also a connection here to female circumcision, referred to outside of these cultures as female genital mutilation. It's theorized that one of the reasons for this is to take control of female sexuality and discourage young women from being sexually active, so that their clitoris is removed in part or in whole at a young age to decrease her potential for sexual excitement and thus intercourse. Her vaginal area may also be sewn almost completely closed, leaving only a small opening for the passage of urine and menstrual blood, making intercourse simply not possible. And then when she is married, it would be opened. But there is a very, very definite, very clear double standard here, and that boys who lose their virginity before marriage in a sexually restrictive culture are not typically punished, much less put to death. So a double standard, having two sets of rules for sexual behavior, one for males and one for females, is pretty common the world over. In Western society, a guy with a lot of sexual experience is a stud, while a girl with a lot of sexual experience is called a slut. This is a double standard. A man with gray hair is distinguished, a woman with gray hair is old. An unmarried man in his 30s is playing the field, while an unmarried woman in her 30s is a spinster. And we could go on and on with examples. I just want to make sure you understand that a sexual double standard is not limited to restrictive cultures. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a restrictive society, one that you might not expect. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Innisfail is a small island off the coast of Ireland and is probably one of the most naive and sexually repressive or sexually restrictive cultures in the world. The people who live on this island seem to have no knowledge of sexual activities that in other societies are very common, like French kissing or mouth stimulation of the breast or hand stimulation of their partner, much less oral sex or same-sex activity. On this island, sex education is virtually non-existent. Parents don't seem to be able to bring themselves to discuss these things they consider embarrassing with their children. They just kind of trust that after marriage, nature is going to take its course and that's it. The men believe that intercourse is hard on their health, that it really drains their strength. So they will specifically abstain from sex the night before they're doing a particularly hard job or the night before a sporting activity or anything that's going to require physical strength. The islanders dislike nudity of any kind, so that only babies are allowed to bathe completely nude, while adults will only wash the parts of their bodies that extend beyond their clothing. And premarital sex is essentially unknown. Even in marital sex, foreplay is generally very limited. So the residents of this society do not believe that it is normal for women to experience an orgasm. And anthropologists have reported that any woman who finds pleasure in sex is viewed as deviant. There's something wrong with her. So mothers teach their daughters that they'll have to submit to their husband's animal cravings, to obey God's order to be fruitful and multiply. So this is a good example of a restrictive culture regarding sexuality. Kind of one step up from this is a semi-restrictive culture. So in these cultures, there's still a feeling that premarital sex is not good. It's not something that should just be completely okay, but it's not strictly enforced as it is in a restrictive culture. So premarital sex occurs, but it's not admitted to openly. It's certainly not encouraged in any ways. And people who are sexually active are expected to be discreet. They're expected to be careful to keep it as private as possible. Maybe even making an effort to appear as modest as possible so that people don't know what they do in private. And in a semi-restrictive culture, generally as long as people are discreet, as long as they're not putting it in somebody's face, sexual activity just continues as it's ignored. Most people know what's going on, and as long as they don't advertise the fact, it's okay. Lastly, in a permissive culture, not only is sexual experience before marriage okay, it might even be specifically encouraged. So for example, in this picture, the Lesu of the South Pacific, masturbation is encouraged even for women and children. So I'm going to read you a quote here. A woman will masturbate if she is sexually excited and there's no man to satisfy her. A couple may be having intercourse in the same house, or near enough for her to see them, and she may thus become aroused. She then sits down and bends her right leg so that her heel presses against her genitalia. Even young girls at about 6 years may do this quite casually as they sit on the ground. The women and men talk about it freely, and there's no shame attached to it. It's a customary position for women to take, and they learn it in childhood. So clearly, it's not just okay, it is encouraged. So it's estimated that about 90% of Pacific Island societies permit premarital sex, as do about 88% of African societies. For the Marquesans of Eastern Polynesia, in this culture, boys and girls participate in a wide range of sexual experiences before puberty. That is the social norm. In fact, a mother will be proud if her daughter has many lovers because it's considered to reflect on her very positively. In Mangea, an island in the South Pacific, sex only for pleasure, not procreation, is viewed as normal and completely acceptable and expected. It's typical for a Mangean boy to first hear of masturbation when he's about 7, and he'll begin to masturbate at 8 or 9, which is viewed very positively and encouraged. Boys and girls are encouraged to get in touch with their own sexuality through sexual play and masturbation. So the boys actively seek out girls, or they even seek him out. So note that in this culture, it's also the absolute norm for the girl to take the initiative. And it's okay and expected for girls to have sexual relations every night before marriage. For girls, they receive sexual instruction from an older woman or an older male who may initiate her, which is another difference. In this culture, an older man in his 20s or 30s or even 40s being sexually active with a teen girl is considered acceptable. The boys may even visit girlfriends in the huts where they sleep with their family. And it's considered okay for parents to listen to their daughters laugh and make noises so that they will know that they have had an orgasm when a young man visits. And when a young man does this, he's referred to as a sleep crawler. So Mangean parents encourage their daughters to have sexual experiences with several men, in part because they want their daughters to eventually find a spouse who makes them happy. So they view maintaining virginity before marriage very negatively because they feel that virgins do not know how to provide sexual pleasure. So very, very different than from what our society is.